All of this discussion from our previous videos in this set lead us, of course, back to financial institutions and how we should best organize them. Now, over the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss a number of issues that are related to what we call organizational behavior and design. And this may be a little bit out of depth for people who it's focused on finance and economics. But nonetheless, you have to recognize that if you want finance and economics to work properly and create value for us, then we really need to think about how we're going to engage the other people that we're hoping to coordinate with. We've seen a number of problems throughout the past, and economists and finance types often overlook the need of human interaction and human participants in a system, focusing purely on its mathematical optimization, much to the detriment of the societies that they hope to optimize for. So let's take a careful walk through some of the basic OB toolkit that we can use for thinking about how to build better financial institutions. This toolkit should provide you with something to work off of as we explore a number of financial technologies over the coming weeks. So to begin with, the first thing that we should think about is the economic function which any given tool is trying to accomplish for us in the most general terms possible. Our goal in this way is to try to identify what kinds of constraints we operate under, as well as where there are opportunities for us to create value. And it often helps to go back to first principles and to not muddy the waters with how we do things now if we hope to think of new ways, better ways to do the thing. Next, that we need to map out what specialists we are required for these kind of activities and what jobs they're going to have to do in order to deliver on the core functions of our organizations. Then we have to evaluate the interests of people who will be occupying each of these roles and try to find ways to align them with the interests of the organization or with its broader objectives. And finally, we need to establish which parties, beyond those directly participating, might be affected by the consequences of organizational optimization, the sort of externalities we were talking about at the end of the last segment. So in our first step, what we want to be thinking about carefully is how the organization itself creates value. We need to understand the value proposition of the tools that we're looking at so that we can consider how to deliver on those same functions without creating further impediments to value creation. There are a number of inefficient mutations that can be created, and by focusing on how these create more value for us, we'll be able to help avoid the kinds of new designs that are actually more destructive than helpful. And this means asking certain kinds of questions. For instance, why are the parties coordinating instead of acting alone? What does each party involved gain from the interaction? What frictions does this tool help us to overcome? And what new costs are created by the use of this tool? Similarly, we want to be able to think in terms of constraints, legal constraints, moral constraints, informational constraints, all of which can impede certain kinds of economic activities. So be certain to map out these kinds of constraints very carefully and be clear about what things you can do and can't do before you start trying to map out how exactly we're going to improve on a coordination system. Next, we want to start thinking in terms of system design, where we map out the necessary steps of a coordinated process, highlighting why things might be done in a particular way. And this often allows us to imagine new methods of doing things. This means that when we are thinking about redesigning something like an insurance company or a stock market, that we think carefully about what an insurance company or a stock market is for, and then have a look at our modern institutions and try to understand why we've chosen certain particular ways of addressing the frictions that these institutions confront. In doing so, it can help us to realize that there may be other ways of performing these core functions that could be more efficient or could deliver new types of value that we don't enjoy at this point in time. That means generally making a list. List out all of the required people and all of the required competencies of those people in order to operate your financial institution. Next, map out any kind of critical information flows that are required to help specialists in their job to coordinate their own internal activities. Then we work on determining appropriate methods and metrics for each process and establish accountability within the organization. Who's responsible for doing what? Who has the authority over what resources? This kind of map gives us, again, some idea about why things are organized the way they are, and we should always be focused on why as opposed to simply what, if we hope to participate in design as opposed to simply mimicking what has already been done by others. Finally, we have to consider where conflicts can arise and then try to allocate managerial authority and oversight within that. There's a very constant debate in organizational behavior regarding the centralization versus decentralization of decision making. In general, when an organization requires more responsiveness to better deliver on its products or better deliver on its objectives, then we tend to see more decentralization being used to deliver. On the other hand, where we require more reliability and efficiency, we tend towards centralization. Now, of course, the allocation of gains and costs that are created by such a system is an important issue for us to think about when we are trying to design better institutions. For instance, who has control of the economic surpluses? Who bears the risks associated with a misallocation of resources? As we move through the course, we'll see that different ownership and governance structures often result from trying to balance these kinds of considerations. And as we explore different kinds of organizations, we will frequently discuss exactly who has ownership and control over the system so that we can get some idea about how these people may choose to allocate the surpluses generated by coordination. Next, we want to be thinking about how to motivate people. The necessary third step in organizational design is to think in terms of carrots and sticks, the kinds of things that we can use to move people's interests into alignment with those of others. Generally speaking, a lot of organized markets may be seen as zero sum, but even in those kinds of cases where we have competition between participants, both of those competitors still gain from a redesign of institutions. For example, in a stock market, both buyers and sellers and market makers generate from speedier execution, more reliable trading partners, faster settlement verification, and of course, dispute resolution systems. So even in a zero-sum interaction, the transaction can still be encouraged or made more efficient by properly trying to align the interests of various participants. And in most cases, when we talk about things like improved execution speed or settlement verification, that's in the interests of both buying and selling parties. Now, when we look specifically at organizations, one of the challenges we run into, as I mentioned earlier in this series of videos, is that some roles simply require more discretion than others do. And when we have these kinds of roles, we can find that these specialists can be difficult to monitor, right? It's hard for us to say whether the CEO has made the right choice or the wrong choice at any given point in time. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that we are not always going to be able to strictly control what people do. Rather than trying to strictly control what people do in sort of a legalist tradition, we can apply to a more Confucianist sort of tradition, in which we try to motivate people to do what is right because it is the right thing, as opposed to motivating them to do the right thing because they will be punished if they don't do it. And so there are a number of internal organizational controls that encourage or nudge people towards doing the right thing when it comes to discretionary resource allocation. These include things like organizational culture, a broad sense of community among the stakeholders that can lead to that sort of super extended family that was discussed in the earlier videos. And there are a variety of others that we can think of. But in general, there are also external controls. External controls include things like rewards and sanctions, compensation, privileges, subsidies, censors, disciplinary action, the public reaction to behaviors, regulatory fines, legal action. These are the kinds of external governance structures that we use to make sure that various people who are providing resources to an institution have some means of redress when they feel that their resources are being misallocated. Now, of course, a number of specialists that we rely on, people like asset managers, underwriters, and executives, are particularly challenging for us to monitor. And so we frequently use things like bonuses, commissions, or profit sharing arrangements to try to motivate the correct kinds of behaviors as well. Rather than simply relying on the idea of people will do the right thing because it is right or because we will punish them. Instead, what we've moved towards is actually providing positive reinforcement to people. encouraging them to make their allocation decisions with certain kinds of objectives in mind. And that usually means suppressing what is in their private best interest in order to advance the interests of the collective organization. Now, even though we might provide bonuses or profit sharing incentives to higher up managers to try to align their interests with the owners of the organization, we usually try to temper these as well with things like clawback provisions or vesting periods for the options or stocks that they've been granted to ensure that we have a long run alignment of interests, not simply something short term, which could ultimately blow up in the face of those providing the resources which are being coordinated. In our last major step, we want to complete what's called a stakeholder analysis. A stakeholder is someone who's affected by the allocation of resources by an institution. Your stakeholders can be internal stakeholders, for example, the employees of the company, but they can also be external stakeholders like communities, future generations, governments, nonprofit entities, environmental concerns, public institutions. When we're thinking in terms of stakeholders, we're not simply thinking in terms of who can effectively hold power over the organization, so much as who is affected by the organization. Because even if those people don't have traditional means of power, those who are negatively affected by the actions of corporations may sometimes seek out complex forms of redress, which can be very destructive. And therefore, it's important for us to think about the implications of our actions on various stakeholders if we hope to be able to forecast the kinds of problems that might emerge in the future. So how do various stakeholders exert influence over the organization? This is something that we should be thinking about as well, because we don't necessarily want to silence people who are bearing the costs of organizational specialization, because at the end of the day, they will end up bearing the greatest amount of the costs. The voiceless generally bear the most costs and derive the fewest rewards from coordination. Therefore, it's important for us to think carefully when we are talking about redesigning our coordination systems from the ground up, who might be affected and how we can bring those people's interests into our decision making, rather than simply trying to oppose them when they oppose our efforts. As a final thought for today, I'd like you to give some consideration to the notion of tinkering with particular allocation systems as opposed to necessarily revolution. In general, what we find is that revolutions in terms of developing organizations do not always produce the best results for us. Some of these can be very, very costly. And in fact, we may be able to derive more value out of our organizations by tinkering in the margins and by offering simple improvements. For example, the simple improvement of multi-speed windshield wipers. It doesn't seem like very much to us in the modern world, but 100 years ago, this was a major innovation that created a lot of extra value. Today, we are very casual about thinking about things like washing machines and dishwashers as simply part of the kitchen. But once again, this created significant improvements in the way that resources were overall allocated. They did not require revolutionary changes in the structure of society to free up time for the workers necessarily. This required simple tinkering with existing technologies that allowed us to make improvements which freed up more time for people. So be aware that even though a lot of entrepreneurs may style themselves as disruptors, not all disruptions add value and most disruptions fail. Therefore, we should probably be thinking, not exclusively, but we shouldn't be neglecting the possibility that small incremental improvements can have vast collective yields when applied across the billions of people who inhabit our planet. In general, a good benchmark is that innovations should be customer driven. Effectively, they should provide more value to the end users of a service or a tool by either rendering something that was otherwise unavailable or delivering the better benefits to lower costs. Now, of course, this can mean that we have better outputs. This could mean that we simply reduce prices. But the fact is that we should be thinking about better user experiences, improvements in reliability, and improvements in customization. These will provide us with a lot of fertile avenues for thinking about how we can make better banks, better companies, better pensions, better derivatives exchanges, without necessarily burning it all down and starting from scratch. In some cases, that can be useful. But remember that most revolutions fail. Not all disruptions add value. So tread carefully. We have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of trying to think through better ways to design society's reallocation systems, and we will be best served by thinking about the principles of organizational behavior when we do so.